This used to be home. 2,000 people lived here once. Children rode bikes on dirt roads. Families gathered at the local tavern on Friday nights. Everyone knew their neighbors in what residents called a little slice of paradise. Today, if you drive through Times Beach, Missouri, you will find hiking trails and picnic tables. A state park where a town used to be. The buildings are gone. The people are scattered across the St. Louis suburbs. And beneath your feet, where children once played, lies the site of the largest soil remediation project in United States history. 265,000 tons of contaminated earth, incinerated at a cost of $110 million. This is the story of the city that died. Not from economic collapse or natural disaster, but from something far more insidious. A few cents worth of waste oil sprayed on dusty roads to keep the dirt down. Times Beach began as somebody's idea of the American dream. In 1925, the Times Beach Corporation bought 480 acres of Missouri River bottomland for $60,000. They had a vision. A summer resort community along the newly minted Route 66, where working families from St. Louis could escape the city heat without breaking the bank. The marketing was brilliant in its simplicity. Lots for as little as $67.50. No down payment required. Just $2 a month and you could own a piece of paradise 25 miles from downtown St. Louis. The target market was clear. These were not luxury vacation homes for the wealthy. This was affordable escape for families who worked in the city's factories and offices, who saved their pennies for a weekend cottage where their children could run free. The developers platted narrow lots along unpaved streets with optimistic names like Elm and Oak and Sunset Drive. They built a small general store, a dance pavilion, and a few permanent structures. Most buyers erected simple summer cottages, often little more than glorified camping cabins with screened porches and basic amenities. But in the context of the 1920s, when automobile ownership was exploding and Route 66 promised adventure, Times Beach felt like the future. A place where ordinary Americans could taste the good life, even if just on weekends. The Merrimack River provided fishing and swimming. The Missouri River bottomland stayed cool even in the worst summer heat. And Route 66 brought a steady stream of travelers who might stop for gas or a meal, providing economic opportunity for enterprising residents. By 1930, Times Beach had about 300 seasonal residents and a handful of year-round families who ran the small businesses that kept the community functioning. It was exactly what the developers had envisioned. A modest success story in the great American expansion westward. What nobody anticipated was how quickly Times Beach would transform from seasonal escape to permanent home. The Great Depression and World War II changed everything. Families who had bought those summer cottages as weekend getaways found themselves converting them into year-round residences. The economics made sense. Land was cheap, taxes were low, and you could own your own home instead of paying rent in the city. By 1940, Times Beach had evolved into a working-class community of about 1,200 residents. The transformation was remarkable. Those simple summer cottages grew into proper homes as families added rooms, enclosed porches, and installed heating systems for Missouri winters. A post office opened in 1941. Local businesses followed. A tavern called the Times Beach Inn became the community's social center, where men gathered after work and families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. Children walked to a one-room schoolhouse until the district built a proper elementary school in 1950. The community developed its own rhythms and traditions. Friday night fish fries at the tavern. Saturday baseball games in the makeshift diamond behind the school. Summer evenings when families sat on their porches and children caught fireflies in mason jars. This was small-town America at its most authentic. Not the Hollywood version with white picket fences and manicured lawns, but the real thing. Modest homes on dirt roads where everybody knew everybody else's business, and that was mostly fine with everyone. Route 66 kept the town connected to the wider world, but Times Beach maintained its own distinct character. Residents took pride in their community's informal spirit. No city council meetings or municipal bureaucracy. Just neighbors helping neighbors and common-sense solutions to shared problems. like hiring someone to spray oil on the dusty roads every summer to keep the dust down. It seemed like such a practical idea at the time. By 1970, Times Beach had reached its peak population of 2,240 residents. These were the golden years, when the community achieved everything its founders had hoped for and more. This was not prosperity in any conventional sense. Most families lived modestly on factory wages and small business income. But they had something that money could not buy in the suburbs. They had community. Standing here, you can almost hear what this place used to sound like. Children's voices calling across the unpaved streets as they rode their bikes and built forts in the woods along the river. The distant hum of traffic on Route 66, bringing travelers and commerce through the heart of their town. The Friday night sounds from the Times Beach Inn, where 3 generations might gather around the same table. Adults talking late into summer evenings while children played kick the can under streetlights. The community had grown organically around the needs of working families. A small grocery store where you could buy milk and bread and catch up on local news. A gas station that doubled as an informal community center where men discussed weather and work while their tanks filled. A volunteer fire department staffed by neighbors who dropped everything when the siren sounded. No city services in the traditional sense. No paved roads, no municipal water system, no sewage treatment plant. Residents relied on wells for water and septic systems for waste. But these limitations created intimacy rather than hardship. Everyone faced the same challenges, and everyone pitched in to solve them, including the chronic problem of dust from the unpaved roads. Every summer, cars and trucks kicked up clouds of dirt that coated houses, gardens, and laundry hanging on backyard lines. Residents had tried various solutions over the years. Gravel helped, but was expensive. Watering the roads worked temporarily, but wasted precious well water during droughts. Then, in 1972, they found what seemed like the perfect answer. A local waste hauler named Russell Bliss offered to spray used oil on their roads for dust control. He charged a modest fee for what appeared to be an ideal solution to a persistent problem. Russell Bliss presented himself as a legitimate waste hauler, but he was spreading chemical weapons byproducts on American soil. Between 1972 and 1976, Bliss sprayed the roads of Times Beach with what residents thought was simple used motor oil. What they got was something far more sinister. The oil contained dioxin-contaminated waste from Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, known as Napaco. This company manufactured hexachlorophene, a key ingredient in Agent Orange production. The toxic waste generated from this process was supposed to be disposed of safely. Instead, Napaco hired Bliss to haul it away for just 3 cents per gallon. Bliss mixed the contaminated waste with used oil and sprayed it on roads across Missouri. Times Beach was just one of dozens of sites where he spread this poison, but it would become the most infamous. The first warning came in 1971 at Shenandoah Stable in Moscow Mills, Missouri. 62 horses died after Bliss sprayed his oil mixture in their arena. The owner, Judy Piatt, spent years fighting to prove the connection between the oil and the deaths. Officials dismissed her concerns. Veterinarians suggested various explanations for the horse deaths. But Piatt refused to accept these dismissals. She became an unlikely environmental crusader, demanding investigations and testing that authorities preferred to avoid. Finally, in 1974, Centers for Disease Control investigators found dioxin contamination 300 times higher than safe levels in the soil at Shenandoah Stable. The investigation traced the contamination directly to Russell Bliss and his waste oil operation. This discovery should have prompted immediate action to identify and test every site where Bliss had spread his toxic mixture. It did not. Regulatory agencies moved slowly. Bliss continued operating, and residents of Times Beach went about their daily lives, unaware that their children were playing in contaminated soil, and their homes were surrounded by one of the most toxic substances known to science. For years, families walked on those oiled roads. Children rode bikes through puddles after rain. Dogs rolled in the dirt. Gardens grew in contaminated soil. And nobody knew. December 1982 brought the Merrimack River flood that would transform Times Beach from a contamination problem into a national emergency. The river had flooded before. Residents were accustomed to high water and the inconvenience of temporary evacuation. But this flood was different. As contaminated floodwater inundated the community, it spread dioxin throughout Times Beach, carrying poison into homes, businesses, and every corner of daily life. When the water receded, what remained was not just flood damage, but a community-wide toxic waste site. On December 23, 1982, the Centers for Disease Control made an unprecedented recommendation. They told all residents of Times Beach not to return to their homes until further notice. The timing added cruel irony to an already devastating situation. Families who had evacuated for what they thought would be a temporary flood displacement found themselves homeless just before Christmas, with no idea when or if they could ever return. The CDC's announcement sent shockwaves far beyond Times Beach. This was the first time in American history that an entire community had been declared too contaminated for human habitation. The story made national news. Times Beach became a symbol of environmental disaster and government failure. Residents found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, their personal tragedy becoming a political football in debates about chemical regulation and corporate responsibility. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Ann Burford faced mounting criticism for the agency's slow response to Times Beach and other contaminated sites. The crisis contributed to her resignation in March 1983 amid accusations of mishandling Superfund cleanup efforts. Her deputy, Rita Lavelle, was later convicted of perjury for lying to Congress about EPA's response to Times Beach and other contamination cases. But political consequences meant little to families whose lives had been shattered. They faced an impossible situation. Their homes were uninhabitable. Their belongings were contaminated. Their community was gone. Many had no savings beyond the equity in houses they could never sell. Insurance companies denied claims, arguing that contamination was not covered under homeowner policies. Legal battles with responsible parties would drag on for years. In February 1983, the federal government announced it would purchase all 801 properties in Times Beach for $33 million. This was the first complete municipal buyout in United States environmental history. Residents had 30 days to accept the offer and permanently relocate. For many, the buyout represented both salvation and tragedy. They received fair market value for homes they could never sell otherwise. But others lost irreplaceable family properties and community connections built over decades. Marilyn Leistner became the last official resident of Times Beach. As the town's final mayor, she stayed until 1985 to oversee the community's dissolution, living alone in her contaminated home while fighting for better compensation for displaced residents. Her refusal to leave immediately symbolized the deep attachment people felt to this place, even after they knew it was killing them. Between 1985 and 1997, every structure in Times Beach was demolished. All contaminated soil was excavated and burned in a specially constructed $110 million incineration facility. 265,000 tons of dioxin-contaminated material went up in smoke in the largest soil remediation project in United States history. The massive incinerator operated 24 hours a day for years, monitored by EPA officials and watched nervously by neighboring communities. When the cleanup was complete, nothing remained of Times Beach except memories and legal precedent. In 1999, the former Times Beach site reopened as Route 66 State Park. Hiking trails now wind through areas where children once played. Picnic tables sit where the Times Beach Inn served Friday night fish fries. A visitor center tells the story of both the historic highway and the environmental disaster. Though the cheerful recreational setting creates cognitive dissonance for anyone who remembers the human cost of creating this success story. I have driven through enough of these towns to know the signs, the optimism that builds communities, the practical decisions that seem sensible at the time. The moment when good intentions collide with consequences no one anticipated. Russell Bliss died in 2006, maintaining until the end that he was an honest businessman who did not know the waste was toxic. He argued that chemical companies and government regulators, not waste haulers, were responsible for knowing what was dangerous. Former Times Beach residents scattered across the St. Louis metropolitan area. Annual reunions continued for decades, with attendance gradually declining as older residents died and younger generations moved away from Missouri entirely. These gatherings became exercises in collective memory, keeping alive stories of a place that officially never existed after 1985. And that is the part that stays with you. Times Beach established the legal and practical precedent for complete municipal buyouts in environmental disasters. The case studies from this tragedy inform EPA decision-making decades later and remain required reading in environmental law schools. What happened here became a template for environmental crisis response, proving that sometimes entire communities must be sacrificed to protect human health. Places remember. Even when people forget. Have you ever driven through Times Beach, Missouri? You should subscribe to Arthur Lee's Adventures and join the growing community of people who believe these stories deserve to be told. Because in the end, Times Beach was not just a contamination site or a Superfund cleanup. It was home. This used to be home. Remember, this video is for educational purposes only. Always do your own research.